Some stories arrive when we least expect them and when we need them most. This one came to me on a quiet afternoon, thinking about second chances and the courage it takes to open a door we thought was closed forever. Clara is 47 years old, a widow, a seamstress in a small Kansas town. She believed her days of hoping were behind her, filed away like fabric patterns she would never use again. Then one summer afternoon, a stranger walked through her door, and everything she thought she knew began to shift. This is a simple story about what happens when we stop waiting for life to find us. The shop bell rang. Clara's scissors stopped mid-cut. She hadn't heard that sound since Tuesday, 4 days of silence. 4 days of measuring fabric for no one. The man in the doorway blocked the afternoon light. Tall, trail dust on his shoulders, a torn shirt clutched in work-roughened hands. He removed his hat. That small gesture made Clara's breath catch. Men didn't do that anymore. Not for a 47-year-old widow who counted her days in yards of calico and spools of thread. Not for a woman the town had already filed under finished. "Ma'am?" His voice was low, unhurried. "I'm looking for someone who can mend this right." Clara set down her scissors, her hands pressed flat against the counter, steadying something she couldn't name. "I can mend it," she heard herself say. 3 small words. She didn't know yet that they would change everything. If this opening stirred something in you, perhaps a memory, perhaps a hope you thought you'd set aside, I'd love to know where you're joining us from today. As my grandmother used to say, a story shared is a blessing doubled. Clara took the shirt from his hands. Their fingers brushed rough calluses against her knuckles, and she stepped back too quickly, bumping the counter's edge. The brass button jar rattled. "Name's Thomas Archer." He watched her. Not the way men usually watched, sizing up what a woman could offer. He watched like he was waiting for permission to keep standing there. "I'm working the Dawson Ranch through autumn." "Clara." She smoothed the torn fabric across the worn wood, examining the split seam. Good cotton, worn soft from years of washing. The stitching along the collar was clumsy, but careful. Someone had tried to mend it before. "Just Clara." 2 days, he asked. "Thursday." "It'll be ready." He nodded once. Put his hat back on. The shop bell rang as the door closed behind him, and Clara stood motionless in the silence that followed. Through the window, she watched him untie a sorrel mare from the hitching post. The horse nuzzled his shoulder. He mounted easy, the way a man does when he's spent more years in the saddle than out of it. Then he was gone down Main Street, and Clara realized her hands were pressed flat against the fabric of his shirt, as if holding something down. She didn't understand the trembling in her fingers. Didn't want to. That evening, after the closed sign was turned and the lamp wick trimmed low, Clara sat in the back room where Edward's things still hung. His canvas work shirt on the nail, his empty pipe rack on the shelf, 6 years of dust settling on the brim of his Sunday hat. She'd stopped counting the days after the first year. Now she only counted in seasons. 6 autumns without his voice, 6 springs without his boots by the door. Clara's hand rose toward the shirt, stopped 6 inches away. The canvas had gone stiff. She knew that without touching it. Knew it would smell like nothing now. Not like him. Not like pipe tobacco and sweat, and the particular warmth of a man who came home every night. Her hand fell back to her lap. She stood, walked to the kitchen, made supper for one. But later, lying awake in the dark, she found herself thinking about that stranger's shirt still folded on her counter, about the care in those clumsy stitches, about why a man who could barely sew would try so hard to mend what was torn. Wednesday morning came gray and still. Clara woke before dawn, as she always did, and lay listening to the silence of the cottage. No breathing beside her, no weight shifting the mattress, just the creak of old boards and the distant crow of Mr. Patterson's rooster 3 streets over. She made coffee in the pot, meant for 2, poured 1 cup, left the other sitting empty on the shelf, where it had sat for 6 years. The walk to the shop took 4 minutes. She'd counted once, years ago, when counting gave her something to do besides think. Past the Abernathy feed store with its grain sacks stacked by the door. Past the general store where Mrs. Harmon's silhouette already moved behind the glass. Arranging jars of penny candy. Past the church with its whitewashed steeple catching the first pale light. Clara unlocked her door. The brass bell stayed quiet. Inside, the air smelled of fabric and dust and the faint sweetness of the cedar chest she kept in the back room. She lit the lamp, though the morning was bright enough to work by. Habit. Edward used to tease her about it. You'd light a lamp at noon if I let you. She pushed that thought away. The torn shirt still lay on the counter where she'd left it. Clara ran her fingers along the split seam. The thread that had given out was cheap, the kind sold by traveling peddlers. 3 spools for a nickel. No wonder it hadn't held. She pulled her sewing basket from beneath the counter, her finest needle, the one with the eye so small she had to hold it to the window to thread, her best waxed linen, the color of fresh cream, 20 cents a spool, and worth every penny. Why are you using the good thread? Clara's hands paused. She didn't answer herself. She began to stitch. The work was simple, just a seam, nothing fancy. But Clara found herself taking her time, making each stitch small and even, pressing the fabric flat between passes. When she finished the seam, she turned the shirt over and examined the collar. Those clumsy repairs she'd noticed before, whoever had done them meant well, but didn't know how. The stitches wandered, pulled too tight in some places, too loose in others. Clara unpicked them, redid them. Her needle moved steady and sure. The shop bell rang. Her head snapped up, heart slamming against her ribs. But it was only Mrs. Harmon, pushing through the door with her basket over her arm and that particular expression she wore when she had news to share. "Morning, Clara." Mrs. Harmon set her basket on the counter, right on top of the unfinished mending. "You'll never guess what I heard about the Miller widow." Clara moved the basket aside. "What about her? Remarried?" Mrs. Harmon leaned in, voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper she saved for the best gossip. "At 42, can you imagine, to a man 10 years younger? Some folks got no shame." Clara's needle hovered over the shirt collar. "Maybe she was lonely." "Lonely," Mrs. Harmon sniffed. "There's lonely, and there's making a spectacle. A woman her age ought to know the difference." The words settled in Clara's stomach like stones dropped in still water. She finished the stitch she was working on. Set the needle down. "What can I help you with today, Mrs. Harmon?" "Pearl buttons, 6 of them. For my Sunday dress?" Clara fetched the button jar, counted out 6, wrapped them in brown paper. 15 cents. Mrs. Harmon paid in pennies, counting each one onto the counter with excruciating slowness. "You're looking peaked," Mrs. Harmon said, gathering her purchase. "Getting enough sleep?" "Plenty." "Well?" Mrs. Harmon's eyes drifted to the shirt on the counter, lingered there. "That's not Edward's shirt." "No." Whose is it? Clara's jaw tightened. A customer's. I see. Mrs. Harmon's tone suggested she saw far more than Clara wanted her to. Well, you take care of yourself, Clara. A woman alone can't be too careful about her reputation. The bell rang as she left. Clara stood motionless for a long moment, her hands flat on the counter, her pulse thick in her throat. A woman alone. As if Clara had chosen this. As if she'd wanted to wake up one morning and find Edward cold beside her. His heart stopped sometime in the night while she slept inches away and heard nothing, felt nothing, knew nothing, until the dawn light showed her what she'd lost. She picked up the needle, finished the mending, wrapped the shirt in brown paper, and tied it with string, setting it aside on the shelf behind the counter. Thursday. The word sat in her mind like a held breath. Thursday morning, Clara woke to sunlight. The gray had lifted overnight, and the shop glowed warm when she unlocked the door. She arranged the ribbon display 3 times before she was satisfied. Blue in front, 4 cents a yard. Red behind, 5 cents. The shirt lay wrapped and ready on the shelf. Clara didn't look at it. She helped Mrs. Patterson choose fabric for new kitchen curtains, cut 12 yards of gingham, made change for $1, listened to news about Mrs. Patterson's daughter in Wichita, the new baby, the difficult birth. 14 hours of labor, Mrs. Patterson said, shaking her head. I told her. I said, that's just how it goes. My mother was in labor with me for 2 days. Clara nodded in the right places. Her eyes kept drifting to the window. The morning stretched long. Customers came and went, the pastor's wife wanting black crepe for mourning bands. Young Sarah Miller buying white cotton for her hope chest. Clara measured and cut and wrapped and made change. And all the while, the brown paper package sat on the shelf, waiting. By noon, her hands had started to tremble. Stop this, she told herself. He's just a customer. But when the bell finally rang at 2:30 and Thomas Archer filled the doorway with afternoon light behind him, Clara's scissors clattered to the counter and she couldn't make herself pick them up. Ma'am? He removed his hat. Same gesture as before. Same unhurried voice. Heard my shirt might be ready. It's ready. Clara turned to the shelf, willed her hand steady, picked up the package, set it on the counter between them. Thomas unwrapped it right there, unfolded the shirt, ran his thumb along the repaired seam, then the collar. This is fine work. He looked up at her, and something shifted in his expression, surprise, maybe, or something else she couldn't quite read. Real fine? You fixed more than I asked. The collar was coming loose. Seemed foolish to leave it. What do I owe you, 15 cents? He counted out the coins, set them on the counter, didn't leave. Clara's pulse jumped. Something else you need? No. Thomas folded the shirt carefully, the way a man does when he values what he owns. Just nice shop you got here. Quiet. Quiet's what I got plenty of. That right? He leaned one hip against the counter, arms loose at his sides, not crowding her, just staying. How long you had this place? Clara heard herself answering before she could stop. 12 years now. My husband built the counters. She hadn't meant to say that. Hadn't meant to mention Edward at all. But Thomas just nodded, looking at the worn wood under his hands. Good counters. Solid work. He was a solid man. I can see that. Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable. Clara realized she'd stopped breathing and made herself draw air. "Well," Thomas said finally. He picked up his shirt, put his hat back on. "Much obliged, ma'am, for the extra work on the collar." "Clara." The word came out before she could stop it. "You can call me Clara." His hand paused on the door. He turned, and for the first time, she saw him smile, just a small lift at the corner of his mouth, barely there and gone. "Clara," he said. "I'll remember that." The bell rang. The door closed. Through the window, Clara watched him mount his sorrel mare, watched him ride down Main Street until the dust settled and there was nothing left to see. She stood behind her counter in the quiet shop, surrounded by bolts of fabric and jars of buttons and the smell of cedar and dust. Her hands were still trembling, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd told a man her name. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed she'd shared with Edward for 19 years, staring at the ceiling where the plaster had cracked in the shape of a river delta. Moonlight fell through the calico curtains. The mantel clock ticked in the front room. A dog barked somewhere on the edge of town, then fell silent. "You can call me Clara." Why had she said that? She never told customers her first name. She was Mrs. Weston to everyone in Stillwater. Had been since the day she married Edward at 22 in the little white church on Maple Street. 25 years of Mrs. Weston. 6 years of the widow Weston. And now she'd gone and invited a stranger, a drifter, a cowboy passing through to call her by her Christian name. She turned on her side. The empty half of the bed stretched cold and vast beside her. "Nice shop you got here." "Quiet. Quiet's what I got plenty of." Clara pressed her face into the pillow. Her cheeks burned in the darkness. Sleep came eventually, shallow and restless. She dreamed of thread unspooling endlessly from her hands, of seams that wouldn't hold no matter how carefully she stitched them. Friday passed. The shop bell rang for Mrs. Patterson again, this time returning the gingham because her husband thought it was too bright for kitchen curtains. Clara exchanged it for a duller pattern without comment, made change, watched the door. Nobody else came. Saturday brought 3 customers, old Mr. Jenkins needing buttons for his work coat, a young mother buying muslin for baby clothes, and the pastor's wife with yet another order of black mourning crepe. Clara measured and cut and wrapped. The afternoon stretched long and empty. Sunday meant church. Clara sat in her usual pew, 3rd row, left side. The wood was hard beneath her, and her corset pinched at the waist. But she kept her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap. Reverend Collins preached about patience, about waiting on the Lord's timing. Clara's mind wandered to a sorrel mare and a man who removed his hat before speaking. She caught herself, fixed her eyes on the pulpit, mouthed the words to the closing hymn without making a sound. After the service, Mrs. Harmon cornered her by the door. "You're looking better," Mrs. Harmon said, which meant she'd been discussing Clara's appearance with someone. "Got some color in your cheeks. Just warm in here." Clara adjusted her bonnet. "The windows don't open enough." Mrs. Harmon's eyes had that calculating look. "Heard that cowboy came back to your shop Thursday. The one from Dawson's place?" Clara's stomach dropped. "He picked up his mending. That's all." "That's all? Well." Mrs. Harmon patted Clara's arm, her fingers pressing a little too hard. "Best to keep it that way. Men like that, they come and go. No sense getting attached." Clara walked home alone. Her shadow stretched long on the dusty road on Cho, and she counted her steps without meaning to. 112 from the church door to her front gate. She'd never counted that particular distance before. Didn't know why she was counting now. Monday brought rain. The shop stayed empty all morning. Clara sat behind the counter working on a commission for Mrs. Reynolds, a christening gown with seed pearl buttons and delicate lace trim. The stitches came out uneven. She unpicked them. Started again. The rain drummed steady on the roof. Water dripped from the leak in the back corner, landing in the bucket she kept there for this purpose. Plunk, plunk, plunk. She thought about nothing. Forced herself to think about nothing. Tuesday the rain stopped. The sun came out hot and bright. Clara opened the shop at 7 sharp, as she always did, and arranged fresh stock in the window display. Blue ribbon, red ribbon, a bolt of yellow calico that had just arrived from Kansas City on last week's freight wagon. Mrs. Abernathy came in for thread. The pastor's wife came for more black crepe, her 3rd order this month. Another mourning band for another family touched by loss. Old Mr. Jenkins returned because he'd lost one of the buttons Clara had sold him Saturday and needed a replacement. The bell rang. The bell stopped ringing. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. Clara found herself standing at the window more than once, watching Main Street, watching nothing at all. Wednesday. The morning passed slow as molasses. Clara sold 6 yards of muslin to a woman she didn't recognize, passing through on her way to Wichita. She made $2 on a custom order of curtains for the hotel. She swept the floor twice, though it didn't need it. She didn't watch the door. At 11:30, the bell rang. Thomas Archer stood in the doorway. No torn shirt this time. No saddlebag slung over his shoulder. Just himself. Hat in one hand, and in the other, 2 tin cups with steam rising from them. "Ma'am?" He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. Corrected himself. "Clara. Figured you might want some coffee." Clara's needle slipped. She sucked in a breath as it pricked her thumb. A bead of blood welled up, dark red against her pale skin. She set down her sewing, pressed her thumb against her apron to stop the bleeding. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He walked to the counter, set 1 cup down in front of her. The tin was dented, stamped with the hotel's mark. "Wanted to?" The coffee smelled strong, stronger than what she made at home, with a hint of chicory underneath. The cup was warm when she picked it up. She wrapped both palms around it without thinking. "Gets quiet in here," Thomas said. He leaned one hip against the counter. Same easy posture as Thursday. "You said that before." "I did. Thought maybe you could use the company." He took a sip from his own cup, watching her over the rim. "If you don't mind." Clara's throat tightened. She didn't know how to answer that. Didn't know what answer would be safe. "I don't mind," she heard herself say. They drank their coffee in the quiet shop. Thomas didn't talk much. Asked a few questions. How long had Stillwater been here? Did she grow up in Kansas? What kind of fabric held up best for a working man's shirts? Clara answered in short sentences at first, then longer ones, then forgot to measure her words at all. She told him about the muslin shipment that came wrong last spring. 3 bolts of pink when she'd ordered white. She told him about Mr. Jenkins and his worn-out Sunday trousers, how he brought them to her every 6 months regular as the season's turning. She told him about the leak in the back corner that Edward had always meant to fix, but never got around to. She stopped when she realized she'd said Edward's name again. "Your husband?" Thomas said. Not a question. Yes. He's been gone a while? Clara looked down at her coffee. It had gone cold in her hands. 6 years. Thomas nodded slowly. He didn't offer condolences. Didn't say any of the things people usually said. He's in a better place. Time heals all wounds. The Lord works in mysterious ways. He just nodded, like he understood something about absence that didn't need words. 6 years is a long time, he said finally. To be alone. Clara's eyes stung. She blinked hard, lifted the cold coffee to her lips and drank without tasting. I manage, she said. I can see that. He set his empty cup on the counter. Doesn't mean you got to... The shop bell rang. Mrs. Patterson pushed through the door she'd measured wrong again and needed another yard of that duller gingham. Clara stood quickly, grateful for the interruption, and Thomas tipped his hat and slipped out while she was cutting fabric. But when Mrs. Patterson finally left with her extra yard tucked under her arm, Clara noticed that Thomas had left his empty cup sitting on the counter. And next to it, a small bunch of wildflowers, black-eyed Susans, and purple coneflower tied together with a twist of prairie grass. No note. No explanation. Just flowers. Still warm from being held in his hand. Clara stared at them for a long moment. Her fingers trembled when she finally reached out to touch the soft yellow petals. When did anyone last bring her flowers? Clara found a mason jar in the back room, behind the bolts of wool she wouldn't need until autumn turned cold. The glass was dusty. She wiped it clean with her apron, filled it with water from the pitcher, and arranged the wildflowers inside. The stems were still warm from being held. She could see where his fingers had gripped them, the slight bend where the prairie grass was tied. She set the jar on the back shelf, next to the cedar chest. Hidden. Safe. Where no one walking past the window would see them. Then she stood there, staring at the yellow petals bright against the shadows. Saw these up on Dawson's Ridge. Reminded me of your shop. Her shop. Full of fabric and dust and the smell of old wood. What about that reminded anyone of wildflowers? Clara picked up the jar. Carried it to the front, set it on the counter where the afternoon light fell in a golden square through the window glass. The black-eyed Susans seemed to glow. The purple coneflowers looked almost blue in the brightness. She moved the jar to the window display. Too exposed. Anyone walking past would see. She moved it back to the counter. Still visible, but not so obvious. A customer might not notice, or they might think she'd picked them herself, walking home from church along the creek bed. Did widows pick wildflowers? Was that something a woman alone was allowed to do? Clara pressed her palms flat against the counter, watched the dust motes drift in the light around the mason jar. She left the flowers where they were. Thursday morning, Clara walked to the general store for lamp oil. The bell over the door jangled as she entered. And the smell hit her pickles and tobacco, and the dusty sweetness of penny candy in glass jars. Mr. Abernathy nodded from behind the register. Clara took a tin of kerosene from the shelf and carried it to the front. Voices drifted from the back of the store, near the pickle barrel. Her age, entertaining that drifter? Mrs. Harmon's whisper carried the way whispers always did in small spaces. What would Edward think? Rest his soul. Clara's hand tightened on the lamp oil tin. Well? Mrs. Patterson's voice, higher and thinner than Mrs. Harmon's. Maybe she's just being neighborly, mending his clothes and such. Neighborly? Mrs. Harmon made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I saw the flowers on her counter yesterday. Fresh picked wildflowers. You think she picked those herself? A pause. Clara held her breath. I think, Mrs. Harmon continued, her voice dropping lower but still carrying, that a woman her age ought to know better. Bad enough being a widow, without a man's protection. Worse to make a spectacle of herself with every cowhand who rides through town. Clara set the lamp oil on Mr. Abernathy's counter. Her hands didn't shake. She wouldn't let them shake. 15 cents, Mr. Abernathy said. If he'd heard the whispers, his weathered face showed nothing. Clara paid in exact change, took the tin, walked out without looking toward the pickle barrel where the two women stood. The bell jangled behind her, and she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until she was inside her shop with the door closed and her back pressed hard against the wood. Her chest burned. Her eyes stung. What would Edward think? She didn't know. That was the worst part. She didn't know what Edward would think because Edward was dead and had been dead for 6 years. And no matter how many times she stood in the back room staring at his shirt, hanging on that nail, he never answered. Clara pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until she saw stars. Then she straightened her spine, unlocked the door, flipped the sign to open, sat behind her counter and picked up her sewing. The wildflowers watched her from their mason jar, yellow and purple against the afternoon light. She didn't move them to the back room. She didn't move them at all. That evening, just as Clara was reaching to flip the sign to closed, the shop bell rang. Thomas stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. The sunset behind him painted Main Street in shades of copper and gold. Evening, he said, closing up. Just about to. He nodded, looked at the floorboards, looked back at her face. Getting dark earlier now, he said. Thought maybe if you don't mind I could walk you home. Clara's mouth went dry. She thought of Mrs. Harmon at the pickle barrel, entertaining that drifter, making a spectacle. I live just 2 blocks from here, she said. It's not far. No, it ain't. Thomas turned his hat in his hands, working the brim between his fingers. Still, Clara looked past him at the empty street. The lamplighter was just starting his rounds, moving from post to post with his long pole and his tin of matches. In another hour it would be full dark, and the boardwalks would be empty, except for men coming out of the saloon. She'd walked home alone for 6 years, 2 blocks, 4 minutes. She knew every crack in the boardwalk, every gap between the planks where a lady's heel could catch. All right, she heard herself say. Let me get my shawl. She locked the shop door behind them. The brass key was warm from her palm. Thomas waited on the boardwalk, watching the lamplighter work his way down the opposite side of Main Street. They walked. Clara kept her hands folded in front of her, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the cooling air. Thomas walked beside her, not too close, not too far. Their footsteps fell into a rhythm on the wooden planks, hers quick and light, his slower, heavier. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The silence should have been uncomfortable. Clara waited for the awkwardness to settle in, for the desperate need to fill the quiet with meaningless words. It didn't come. The silence stretched between them like something shared, rather than something missing. They passed the Abernathy feed store, closed and dark for the night, past the church with its white steeple catching the last red light of sunset, past the Patterson house with its lamp already glowing warm in the front window. Clara's cottage appeared ahead. The white picket fence with the paint peeling on the west side where the weather hit hardest. the calico curtains in the window, the gate that had needed oiling since March and still squeaked when you pushed it open. She stopped at the fence. Thomas stopped beside her. "This is me," she said. Her voice came out softer than she intended. "Nice place." Thomas looked at the cottage, at the small garden going brown at the edges, at the empty porch where 2 rocking chairs used to sit before Clara moved one inside because she couldn't bear looking at it anymore. "Looks peaceful." Clara's throat tightened. "It's quiet." "That ain't the same thing, is it?" "No, it wasn't." Thomas put his hat back on. Touched the brim with 2 fingers in that gesture she was starting to recognize. "Good night, Clara." He turned, started walking back toward Main Street, his boots quiet on the packed dirt road. Clara watched him go, watched until he rounded the corner past the church and disappeared into the gathering dark. Then she opened the gate, it squeaked, just like always, and walked up the path to her front door. Inside, the cottage was dark and cold. She lit the lamp, started a fire in the stove, put the kettle on for tea she didn't really want. Through the kitchen window, she could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. The same stars she'd looked at every night for 6 years. The same window, the same kettle, the same empty chair across the table. But something had shifted. Something small and nameless that she couldn't quite put back where it had been before. "Good night, Clara." "Not ma'am." Not Mrs. Weston. Clara. She poured her tea, sat in her chair, let the cup warm her hands while the fire crackled and the stars multiplied in the sky outside her window. Tomorrow was Friday. The shop would open at 7. Customers would come and go. The bell would ring and fall silent. Life would continue exactly as it always had. But when Clara finally climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she stopped at the window that overlooked Main Street. And she stood there for a long time in the darkness, watching the empty road, waiting for something she couldn't name. Saturday passed in a blur of customers and small transactions. Clara sold ribbon and buttons and 3 yards of calico. She answered questions about fabric weight and thread count. She smiled when smiling was required and kept her eyes away from the wildflowers, still sitting in their mason jar on the counter. The flowers were starting to droop. The black-eyed Susans had curled inward at the edges. The purple coneflowers had faded to something closer to gray. She should throw them out. She knew she should throw them out. She didn't. Sunday morning came bright and hard. Clara dressed in her good dress, dark blue wool, with a white lace collar and mother-of-pearl buttons running down the front. The same dress she'd worn every Sunday for 4 years now. The hem was starting to fray where it brushed the floor, and one of the buttons had been replaced with a slightly lighter shade. She'd meant to fix both problems. She never had. The walk to church took 7 minutes. Past the feed store, closed and shuttered. Past the general store, also closed, its windows dark. Past the hotel with its curtains drawn against the morning sun. The church bell was already ringing when Clara arrived. She slipped through the heavy wooden doors and took her usual pew 3rd row, left side. The wood was hard beneath her, the same way it had been hard for 25 years of Sunday mornings. No cushion. Reverend Collins didn't believe in cushions. Said they made the congregation too comfortable, too likely to drift into sleep instead of salvation. Clara folded her hands in her lap, kept her eyes forward. Behind her, she heard the rustle of skirts, the creak of the pew as someone settled into it. Mrs. Harmon's voice, low but carrying, "Good morning. Ethel, lovely hat." Mrs. Patterson murmured something in response. More rustling. A throat cleared. Then silence. Clara felt eyes on the back of her neck. The fine hairs there stood up, prickling against her collar. She didn't turn around. Reverend Collins climbed to the pulpit, opened his Bible, adjusted his spectacles on his nose, cleared his throat with that particular sound that meant he had something important to say. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "today I wish to speak about propriety, about the sacred duty we owe to our community and to the Lord who watches over us all." Clara's spine stiffened. "In these modern times," Reverend Collins continued, his voice rising to fill the small church, "it is easy to forget the standards that bind us together as a God-fearing people. Easy to let our behavior slip. Easy to give our neighbors cause for concern." The words fell like stones dropped into still water. Clara felt each ripple spreading outward, pressing against her skin. "A woman's reputation," Reverend Collins said, leaning forward over the pulpit, "is like a piece of fine china. Once cracked, it cannot be mended. Once broken, it cannot be restored. No amount of good works or righteous intentions can undo the damage of improper conduct." Clara's hands clenched in her lap. Her knuckles went white against the dark fabric of her dress. Was he speaking to her, or was she hearing accusation where none existed? She couldn't tell anymore. Couldn't separate her own shame from her imagination. The congregation rose for the hymn. Clara stood with them, her legs unsteady beneath her. She opened her hymnal to the right page, shaped the words with her lips. No sound came out. Beside her, Mrs. Reynolds sang in a clear soprano that seemed to pierce straight through Clara's skull. Behind her, Mrs. Harmon's alto rose and fell in practiced devotion. The organ swelled. The rafters rang. Clara's throat stayed closed. When the service ended, she slipped out the side door before anyone could corner her with questions or comments or that particular kind of sympathy that felt more like condemnation. Before Mrs. Harmon could offer another piece of friendly advice, before Mrs. Patterson could look at her with those pitying, knowing eyes, she walked home fast, her boots clicking sharp on the boardwalk, her breath coming quick and shallow in her chest. The cottage was empty when she arrived, empty the way it always was, empty the way it would always be. Clara sat in the kitchen without removing her good dress. She sat there until the light changed and the shadows lengthened and the church bells rang for evening service. She didn't go back. Monday morning, Clara opened the shop at 7. She swept the floors, arranged the ribbon display, changed the water in the mason jar. Though the wild flowers were past saving, now petals brown and curling, stems gone soft. She didn't watch the door. At 9 o'clock, the shop bell rang. Mrs. Harmon walked in. No basket this time. No pretense of shopping. She wore her black lace gloves folded over her hands and that particular set to her jaw that meant she had something to say and intended to say it. "Clara," she stopped in front of the counter, her eyes sweeping over the drooping flowers with undisguised satisfaction. "We need to talk." Clara set down her scissors. "About what you know perfectly well what—" Mrs. Harmon's voice was sugar over steel. "This has gone far enough. I don't know what you mean." "Don't play coy with me, dear. It doesn't become you." Mrs. Harmon leaned forward, close enough that Clara could smell the rose water she used to scent her handkerchiefs. "That cowboy, The one from Dawson's place. He's been coming here every day, bringing you coffee, bringing you flowers, walking you home in a plain view of half the town. Once, Clara's voice came out flat and steady. He walked me home once. Once is enough. Mrs. Harmon's eyes were hard as river stones. People are talking. Clara, I'm telling you this as a friend, because someone needs to say it before you ruin yourself completely. Your reputation, everything Edward worked to build for you, you're throwing it all away for a drifter who'll be gone by first frost. Clara's hands found the edge of the counter. Held on. My reputation, she said slowly, has been the same for 6 years. Widow. Seamstress. That's all. Exactly. And that's respectable. That's proper. Mrs. Harmon straightened, her chin lifting. But this, she gestured at the dying flowers, at the shop, at Clara herself. This is something else entirely. This is a woman who's forgotten her place, my place. The words tasted bitter on Clara's tongue. Your place as Edward's widow. Your place in this community. Mrs. Harmon's voice softened, but the steel remained underneath. I know you're lonely, Clara. We all know. But there are proper ways to deal with loneliness. And there are ways that bring shame on a family's memory. Think of what Edward would say. Clara couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around something sharp and jagged that wouldn't go down. Mrs. Harmon patted her arm, the same way she might pat a child who'd misbehaved. Send him away, before it's too late. She left without buying anything. The bell rang. The silence that followed pressed against Clara's ears like cotton wool, thick and suffocating. Clara stood behind her counter. Her hands trembled against the wood. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. The wildflowers drooped in their jar, petals scattering across the worn counter like confetti at a funeral. The afternoon crept past. Customers came and went. Clara measured and cut and made change, her hands moving without her mind's permission. Her mouth saying the right things at the right times. Inside, something was cracking. At 3 o'clock, the shop bell rang. Thomas walked in with his hat in his hands and that easy way of moving that she'd found herself looking for without meaning to. His face was open, glad to see her, expecting nothing but her company. Clara didn't stand up. Afternoon. He crossed toward the counter, already reaching into his pocket. Brought you something. Found these berries up on the ridge that I thought, don't. The word cut him off mid-sentence. He stopped 3 feet from the counter, his expression shifting from open warmth to wary confusion. Don't what? Clara reached into the cash box. Her fingers found the coins she'd set aside days ago, 15 cents. The exact amount he'd paid for the mending. She pushed them across the counter toward him. Here, she said. We're square now. Thomas looked at the coins, looked back at her face. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the weathered skin. What's this about, Clara? Nothing. She heard her own voice as if from a great distance, cold and flat and belonging to someone else entirely. There ain't nothing here for you, Mr. Archer? Best you stop coming around. The name hit him like a slap. Mr. Archer. Not Thomas. Not anymore. He stood very still. His hands tightened on his hat brim, knuckles going white, then loosening again. Clara. I mean it. She couldn't look at him. couldn't bear to see whatever was in his eyes. This was a mistake. All of it. The coffee and the flowers and the walks home. People are talking. I can't. Her voice cracked. She forced it steady. I can't do this. Silence filled the space between them. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was quiet. Careful. Is that what you really want? Clara's throat closed around the words. She forced them out anyway. Yes. Another silence. Longer this time. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. All right, Thomas said finally. His voice had gone flat, all the warmth drained out of it. If that's what you want, I'll respect it. He put his hat back on, turned toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. The flowers, he said, without turning around. You don't have to keep them. The bell rang. The door swung shut behind him. Clara sat alone in her shop, surrounded by fabric and thread and the smell of cedar and dust. The 15 cents lay untouched on the counter where she'd pushed them. He hadn't taken the money. The wildflowers drooped in their mason jar, petals falling one by one onto the worn wood. Clara watched them fall, and she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like winter cold, that she had just made the worst mistake of her life. 3 days passed. The shop bell rang for Mrs. Reynolds, collecting her finished christening gown. It rang for Mr. Jenkins, paying 2 bits for his mended Sunday trousers. It rang for strangers passing through, for women buying ribbon, for the pastor's wife with another order of black mourning crepe. It never rang for Thomas. Clara served her customers, measured fabric, made change, smiled when smiling was required. Her hands moved. Her mouth spoke the right words at the right times. The rest of her stood somewhere far away, watching through thick glass. On the second day, she caught herself pausing every time boots sounded on the boardwalk outside. Her head would lift. Her heart would jump. And then a stranger would walk past the window without stopping. On the third day, she made herself stop looking up. The wildflowers were dying. Clara watched them wilt in their mason jar. The black-eyed Susans drooped first, their yellow petals curling inward like fists closing. The purple coneflowers followed, stems going soft, their color fading to something dull and tired. The water in the jar had turned cloudy, and a smell was starting sweet and rotten. The smell of things that had gone too long without care. She should throw them out. They were dead. They were taking up space on her counter where customers could see them and wonder. Every time Mrs. Harmon walked past the window, her eyes went straight to that jar, and her thin lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Clara couldn't make herself do it. Thursday evening. She sat alone in the shop after closing. The lamp burned low. Shadows crept in from the corners. Clara reached into the mason jar and pulled out one black-eyed Susan, the least wilted, the one that still held something of its original shape despite everything. She opened her account ledger. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling. Inside, neat columns recorded every sale, every penny earned, every yard of fabric cut and sold. 6 years of careful numbers, 6 years of duty. She pressed the flower flat between 2 pages, closed the book quickly, before she could think about what she was doing. Placed it back on the shelf where it belonged. Friday morning brought rain. Clara opened the shop late 8 o'clock instead of 7. She'd overslept for the first time in years. Trapped in dreams she couldn't remember, but that left her throat tight and her pillow damp with something that might have been tears. The rain fell steady against the windows, streaking the glass. Water dripped from the leak in the back corner, filling the bucket with a sound like slow counting. Plunk, plunk, plunk. No customers came. Clara sat behind her counter, staring at the dying flowers. The water in the jar had gone brown now. More petals had fallen overnight, scattered across the wood like small surrenders. At noon, she finally picked up the jar, carried it to the back door, stepped outside into the rain. The alley behind her shop was narrow and muddy. Rain had turned the packed earth into a slick of brown water, churned by wagon wheels and boot heels into something thick and treacherous. Clara stood on the single wooden step, jar in her hands, and tipped the dead flowers into the muck. They fell with a wet slap. Yellow petals, purple petals, brown stems, all of it sinking into the mud, disappearing into the mess. Clara turned to go back inside. Her foot slipped. The step was wet, slick with rain. Her boots were old, the soles worn smooth from years of walking the same paths. She felt herself tilting before she could stop it, arms wheeling, jar dropping from her hands and shattering against the step, body pitching backward into empty air. She hit the mud hard. The impact drove the breath from her chest. Cold water soaked through her dress, her petticoats, her underclothes, all the way to her skin. Mud splashed across her face, into her hair, between her fingers as she tried to push herself up. Her hands slipped. She went down again, this time on her hands and knees. The mud sucked at her palms, cold and thick and smelling of rot. Clara knelt there in the alley, covered in filth, rain streaming down her face, and something inside her cracked wide open. A sound came out of her throat. Not a sob, not a scream. Something ugly and broken in between. Her shoulders shook. Her hands curled into fists in the mud, squeezing until it oozed between her fingers. 6 years of holding on. 6 years of keeping her spine straight and her face composed and her grief locked behind her teeth where no one could see it. She couldn't hold it anymore. The tears came, hot against her rain-cold cheeks, mixing with the mud, the dirty water, the dead flowers floating in the muck around her knees. She cried the way she hadn't cried since the morning she woke up next to Edward's cold body and realized she'd slept through his dying. Ugly crying. Gasping crying. The kind that twisted her face and made no sound because there wasn't enough air left in her lungs to make sound. She cried until she was empty. Then she knelt in the mud a little longer, rain soaking through to her bones, and let the shame of it settle into her skin. 47 years old. A widow, a businesswoman, on her hands and knees in an alley covered in filth, crying over dead flowers that a man she'd pushed away had picked for her on a ridge somewhere. What would Edward think? What would anyone think? Clara pressed her muddy hands against her face and laughed. The sound came out cracked and strange. More sob than humor. Nobody would think anything, because nobody was watching. Nobody cared enough to watch. That was the truth she'd been hiding from for 6 years. She cleaned herself up as best she could, changed into the spare dress she kept in the back room, plain gray wool. Nothing fancy. Washed the mud from her face and hands with water from the pitcher, combed her wet hair back, and pinned it up with shaking fingers. The shop stayed closed. Clara sat in the back room, wrapped in her shawl against the chill, watching the rain fall past the single small window. The room smelled of cedar and dust and the faint ghost of Edward's pipe tobacco, though he hadn't smoked in 6 years and the smell was probably just her imagination. His shirt still hung on the nail. 6 years. She hadn't touched it in all that time. Hadn't washed it. Hadn't moved it. Hadn't done anything but look at it from across the room like it was something holy, something sacred, something that would crumble to dust if she laid hands on it. She'd been afraid. Afraid that touching it would make him more gone than he already was. Clara stood. Her legs trembled beneath her, weak from the cold and the crying. She crossed the small room, her stockinged feet silent on the wooden floor. The shirt hung limp on its nail. Canvas work shirt. The kind Edward had worn every day of their married life. Patched at the elbow, her stitching. From the year before he died. The collar was frayed. The buttons were mismatched because he'd lost one, and she'd replaced it with whatever she had on hand. She reached out. The canvas was stiff against her fingers. Cold. It didn't smell like him anymore. Didn't smell like anything except age and dust and absence. Edward. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. Too alive in a space filled with dead things. Would you have wanted this for me just waiting for nothing? No answer. The rain against the window. The drip of water in the bucket in the corner. 6 years I've been holding on. Her voice cracked. What am I holding? She lifted the shirt from the nail. The fabric was lighter than she remembered. Smaller. She'd built it up in her mind as something enormous, something that could fill all the empty spaces he'd left behind. But it was just a shirt. Just canvas and thread and old sweat stains that had faded to nothing. Clara folded it twice. Carefully, the way she folded everything, neat edges, sharp corners. She carried it to her mother's cedar chest. The lid creaked when she lifted it. Inside lay her wedding dress, yellowed with age. A pair of baby shoes that had never been worn. Letters tied with faded ribbon. All the things that used to be her life. She laid Edward's shirt on top. Closed the lid. The nail on the wall was empty now. Just a piece of iron driven into wood. Nothing sacred about it. Nothing holy. Clara sat on the floor beside the chest. The rain had softened to a gentle patter. The light through the window had turned gray and tender. She didn't cry again. She'd emptied herself of tears in the mud outside. But something had shifted. Not healed shifting wasn't healing. But something that had been locked tight for 6 years had finally opened. Saturday morning, Clara opened the shop at 7. She swept the floors, arranged the ribbon display, looked at the empty spot on the counter where the mason jar used to sit. The 15 cents Thomas had refused still lay there. She picked up the coins, put them in the cash box where they belonged. At 10:30, Mr. Abernathy from the feed store stopped by. He needed buttons for his work coat. He'd lost another one. Same as always. Clara sold him 4. Wrapped them in brown paper, made change for a dime. Heard the news? Mr. Abernathy asked, pocketing his buttons. What news? That cowboy working Dawson's place. Mr. Abernathy shook his head, already turning toward the door. Got a job offer up Montana way. Leaving by end of the week? I heard good riddance? Some folks say. Clara's hand stopped on the counter. Leaving. That's what I heard. Mr. Abernathy tipped his hat. "You have a good day now, Mrs. Weston." The bell rang. The door swung shut behind him. Clara stood alone in her shop, surrounded by fabric and thread, and the smell of cedar, and dust, and absence. Thomas was leaving because she told him to go. Clara's hands moved to the bolt of indigo fabric on the counter. She picked up her scissors, started to cut a length for the hotel's curtain order. The blade slipped. The line went crooked, veering off at an angle that ruined the whole yard. She stared at the spoiled fabric. 12 cents wasted. She'd never cut fabric wrong in her life. Not once in 12 years of running this shop. Thomas was leaving. The scissors clattered to the counter. Clara pressed her palms flat against the wood, feeling the grain beneath her skin. The solid reality of something that wouldn't shift beneath her. End of the week. Mr. Abernathy had said, that could mean tomorrow. That could mean today. Because she told him to go. Because Mrs. Harmon and her whispers and her satisfied smile mattered more than what Clara looked around her shop. The bolts of fabric in their careful rows, the ribbon display she'd arranged and rearranged 100 times. The empty spot on the counter where the wildflowers used to sit before she threw them in the mud. 12 years of her life, measured out in yards of calico and spools of thread, and the careful preservation of a reputation that meant nothing to anyone except the people who wanted to see her fail. This was what she'd chosen. Safety. Propriety. The slow, quiet death of never wanting anything again. The clock on the wall read 1:15. Clara walked to the front door. Her hands shook as she reached for the sign, flipped it from open to closed. First time in 12 years she'd closed early. First time since Edward died that she'd done anything that wasn't scheduled, planned, expected, approved. She stood there with her hand on the sign, looking out at Main Street through the glass. The boardwalk was mostly empty in the afternoon heat. A wagon rolled past, kicking up dust. Mrs. Patterson crossed the street with her market basket over her arm, heading toward the general store. Normal. Everything normal. Inside Clara's chest, something was breaking apart. Or maybe breaking open. She walked to the back room. The cedar chest sat where it had always sat. Solid and dark, and full of things she'd finally allowed herself to put away. The nail on the wall was empty now, just iron and wood and nothing else. Clara touched it. The metal was cold against her fingertip. She'd put Edward's shirt in that chest yesterday. Let him go after 6 years of holding on to something that couldn't hold her back. And what had she done with that freedom? Pushed away the only person who'd looked at her like she was still alive. The thought hit her like a hand across the face. She'd spent 6 years being the widow. The seamstress. The woman who kept to herself and caused no trouble and gave no one anything to talk about. She'd built a life out of not living, and when someone finally came along who saw through it all, who brought her coffee and wildflowers, and asked what she liked instead of telling her what she should be, she'd shoved him away with both hands. Not because she didn't want him there, because she did. And wanting things was dangerous. Wanting things meant you could lose them. Wanting things meant opening yourself up to the judgment of people like Mrs. Harmon, who had nothing better to do than count the cracks in other people's china. Clara had spent 6 years making herself small enough that losing anything else wouldn't matter. But it hurt anyway. It hurt right now. Standing in this back room with the empty nail and the cedar chest and the silence pressing in from every direction. She thought of Thomas's face when she pushed those coins across the counter, the way his jaw had tightened. The way he'd said, "If that's what you want," in that careful, flat voice that meant she'd wounded him somewhere deep. She thought of the wildflowers, of the coffee he brought her without being asked, of the way he removed his hat every single time, like she was someone worth showing respect to. She thought of Mrs. Harmon's words, "Think of what Edward would say." But Edward was gone, and Clara was still here. And she'd been so busy being faithful to a memory that she'd forgotten how to be faithful to herself. Clara straightened her spine. Her hands stopped trembling. She knew what she needed to do. The walk from Clara's shop to Ms. Reed's boarding house was 2 blocks, 4 minutes if you walked slow, less than 100 yards of wooden boardwalk and packed dirt road. Clara had never walked that particular route before. Never had reason to. She stepped out onto the boardwalk. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, the sky clear and blue after yesterday's rain. The mud in the street had dried to a cracked crust that would turn to dust by evening. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She started walking, one foot in front of the other. Past the ribbon display in her own shop window, past the empty hitching post where Thomas used to tie his sorrel mare when he came to visit. The Abernathy feed store came first. Mr. Abernathy was outside, stacking grain sacks against the wall. He looked up as Clara passed, nodded. She nodded back and kept walking. The general store was next. Clara saw Mrs. Harmon through the window before Mrs. Harmon saw her. The older woman stood at the counter, deep in conversation with Mr. Patterson about something. Her black lace gloves were folded in her hands. That particular tilt to her chin meant she was sharing information she considered important. Then Ms. Harmon's head turned. Her eyes met Clara's through the glass. Clara didn't slow down, didn't speed up, just kept walking at the same steady pace. She watched Mrs. Harmon's expression change. Recognition first, then confusion, then something sharper. As understanding dawned, Clara was walking toward the boarding house. In the middle of the day, with the whole town watching. Mrs. Harmon's lips pressed into a thin line. Clara walked past. She didn't look back. The church came next. White steeple catching the afternoon light. The heavy doors were closed, the windows dark. Somewhere inside, Reverend Collins was probably preparing another sermon about propriety and reputation and a woman's proper place. Clara kept walking. Her boots clicked on the boardwalk. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet afternoon. She could feel eyes on her from windows, from doorways, from the spaces between buildings where people gathered to exchange news. Let them watch. Let them talk. They'd been talking about her for 6 years anyway. And all her careful propriety hadn't stopped a single wagging tongue. The boarding house appeared at the end of the block. 2 stories of weathered wood, a wraparound porch with rocking chairs that had seen better days, green shutters with paint peeling at the corners. Mrs. Reed's establishment, where cowboys and traveling salesmen and men passing through could get a bed and a hot meal for 2 bits a night. Clara stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Her palms were damp. Her mouth had gone dry as August dust. This was it. This was the moment when she could still turn back. She could walk to her shop, flip the sign to open, pretend none of this had happened, go back to measuring fabric and making change and watching the door for customers who weren't the ones she wanted to see. Go back to being safe. Go back to being dead while her heart was still beating. Clara climbed the steps. The porch boards creaked under her weight. Someone's pipe smoke lingered in the air, sweet and sharp. An empty rocking chair moved slightly in the breeze. She knocked on the door. Footsteps inside. The door opened. Mrs. Reed stood in the doorway, a small, sharp-eyed woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked Clara up and down, taking in the plain gray dress, the hair pinned up hastily, the flush spreading across her cheeks. "Help you." "I'm looking for Thomas Archer." Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Is he here?" Mrs. Reed's eyes narrowed. Her gaze moved past Clara to the street, where no doubt half the town was watching through various windows and doorways. Her thin lips pressed together. The cowboy. He's upstairs, packing his things to leave. A pause. "You want I should fetch him?" "Please." Mrs. Reed studied her for another long moment. Then she turned and disappeared into the dim hallway. Clara heard footsteps on stairs. Muffled voices. She stood on the porch, her hands clasped in front of her, her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. What was she going to say? What words could possibly make this right? I was wrong. I was scared. I've been scared for 6 years, and I don't want to be scared anymore. The door opened. Thomas stood in the doorway. His shirt was untucked. His suspenders hung loose at his sides. His hair was mussed like he'd been running his hands through it. And his face was guarded, careful, showing nothing. "Clara." His voice was flat. "What are you doing here?" She looked at him, at the wariness in his eyes, at the careful way he held himself, braced for whatever blow she was about to deliver. She'd done that. She'd put that look on his face. "I was wrong." The words came out before she could second-guess them. "And I ain't too proud to say it." Thomas didn't move, didn't speak. Clara took a breath, let it out. "I've been scared so long I forgot what brave felt like. But I ain't scared of you, Thomas. Never was." Her voice cracked. She made herself keep going. "I'm scared of wanting something again. That's different. And it wasn't fair of me to make that your burden to carry." Still nothing. Thomas stood in the doorway like a man braced for a storm that hadn't hit yet. Mrs. Harmon and the rest of them can talk all they want. Clara lifted her chin. "I spent 6 years making myself small so nobody would have anything to say about me. You know what I learned? They talked anyway. They always talk. So I figure I might as well give them something worth talking about." Something shifted in Thomas's face. The wariness cracked, just a little. "You told me to leave," he said quietly. "Said there wasn't nothing here for me." "I lied." Clara's eyes burned. She blinked hard. "I lied because I was scared, and scared people do foolish things. You made me want things I'd stopped letting myself want. That terrified me." Thomas's jaw worked. Something moved behind his eyes, pain fighting with hope, fighting with the memory of what she'd done to him. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. "Got a job waiting in Montana. Good money. Steady work." Clara nodded. Her throat was tight. "I know. So what do you want from me, Clara?" His voice was rough now, stripped of that careful flatness. "You want me to stay? Is that what you came here to ask?" The question hung between them in the warm afternoon air. Clara felt the weight of it, felt the weight of everything she'd done and not done for 6 years, everything she'd hidden from and run away from and locked in cedar chests. She met his eyes. "I'm asking," she said, "if you'd give me one more chance to stop being afraid." Thomas stood very still in the doorway. His eyes searched her face, looking for something, a crack, a hesitation, a sign that she would change her mind again and leave him standing here with nothing. Clara held steady. Let him look. "One more chance," he said slowly. The words came out careful, like he was testing each one before he let it go. "Yes." A long moment passed. The afternoon light slanted across the porch, catching dust motes in the warm air. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and fell silent. A wagon creaked past on the road below, the driver not even glancing up at the two people standing in Mrs. Reed's doorway. Then Thomas stepped aside. "Come sit," he said, "if you want." Clara walked onto the porch. Two rocking chairs sat by the railing, their paint worn smooth from years of use. She took the one closest to the street. Let anyone who wanted to watch see her sitting there in plain view. Thomas settled into the other chair. He didn't rock, just sat with his hands loose on his knees, watching her with those careful eyes. "What changed your mind?" he asked. "Really?" Clara looked out at Main Street. Mrs. Patterson was crossing toward the church, her market basket on her arm. She glanced up at the boarding house porch. Her steps slowed. Then she kept walking. "Edward's shirt," Clara said. "I finally put it away. Yesterday. After the rain." Thomas waited. 6 years I kept it hanging on that nail in the back room. Like if I moved it, he'd be more gone than he already was. Clara's throat tightened. "But he was already gone. Been gone since the night he died in his sleep while I lay right there beside him. I was just holding on to the shape of him, wearing my grief like armor so nobody could get close enough to hurt me again." "Did it work?" "No." Clara shook her head. "It just kept everyone out. Made sure I'd stay alone forever. Including yourself." She turned to look at him. His profile was sharp against the afternoon light's strong jaw, lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into too many prairie suns. "Including myself," she said. The words hung between them. True words. Hard words. Thomas nodded slowly. He understood something about that. She could see it in his face, something about loss and holding on, and the ways a person could build a prison out of their own pain without even knowing they were doing it. "I ain't asking for forever," he said quietly. "That's too much for anyone to promise. Forever's a long time. And I learned a while back that making promises I can't keep just ends up hurting everyone." Clara's hands tightened on the arms of the rocking chair. "What are you asking for, then, tomorrow?" He met her eyes, held them. "Just tomorrow. We'll see about the day after when it comes." Clara's eyes stung. She blinked, looked down at her hands, weathered from years of needlework, resting on the worn wood of the chair arm. "I can do tomorrow," she said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Then I sent word to Montana this morning. Told them I found work enough here in Stillwater. The Dawson Ranch needs a hand through winter. And after that?" He shrugged. "We'll see." Clara looked up at him. Something loosened in her chest, a knot she hadn't known was there. "You're staying?" "Seems like there might be something worth staying for." The corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly. "If you don't mind." Clara didn't trust her voice. She shook her head. She didn't mind. The cottonwood tree outside Clara's shop had turned gold. 1 month had passed since that afternoon on Mrs. Reed's porch. 1 month of tomorrows, stacking up one after another like coins in a jar. 1 month of Thomas stopping by the shop for coffee, for conversation, for no reason at all, except that he wanted to see her, and she wanted to be seen. The town still talked. Clara had stopped listening. This morning, the shop smelled of cedar and the cool bite of early autumn coming through the windows she'd cracked open. The glass was clean, she'd washed it yesterday, scrubbing until it sparkled in the light. Fresh wildflowers sat in a mason jar on the counter, late-blooming asters, purple and white, with a few sprigs of goldenrod mixed in. Thomas's hat hung on a hook by the door. A new hook, iron, that he'd put up himself 2 weeks ago. His hook now, his place. The shop bell rang. Clara looked up from the ribbon she was sorting. Sarah Miller stood in the doorway, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright with something that looked like barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Clara?" Sarah crossed to the counter in quick steps, her skirts swishing. "I'm getting married. Daniel proposed last night, down by the creek." Clara set down the ribbon. "That's wonderful news. Sarah, when's the wedding?" 6 weeks. Mama says that's too soon, but we don't want to wait." Sarah's hands twisted together in front of her. "I need a dress, a real wedding dress. I was hoping you could help me choose the fabric." "Of course." Clara came around the counter. "Let me show you what I have." They spent the next hour looking at options: white muslin, soft as clouds, cream-colored cotton with a subtle weave, a bolt of ivory silk that had arrived from Kansas City just last week, expensive, 40 cents a yard. But the way it caught the light made it worth every penny. Sarah touched the silk with careful fingers. "This is beautiful. But I couldn't. Mama would say it's too dear." "It's your wedding day," Clara said. "You get to decide what's too dear." Sarah bit her lip. Her eyes kept going back to the silk, hungry and uncertain. "Mrs. Clara?" She looked up. "Can I ask you something? Something personal?" "Of course." "How do you know when it's right, the dress? I mean, or—" Sarah hesitated. "Or anything." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about Edward, about the 19 years they'd had together. The good ones and the hard ones. The morning she woke up beside his cold body and the 6 years she'd spent trying to pretend she was still alive. She thought about Thomas, about the way he removed his hat before speaking, about the wildflowers and the coffee and the way he never asked for more than she could give. "When you stop looking for reasons to say no," she said finally, "that's when you know." Sarah's face softened. She looked at the ivory silk again, reached out and touched it one more time. "I'll take 4 yards, she said. Clara measured the fabric, cut it carefully, her scissors moving clean and sure, wrapped it in brown paper, tied it with string. The shop bell rang again. Thomas stood in the doorway with a paper sack in his hand. He nodded at Sarah as she passed him, her package clutched to her chest, then crossed to the counter with that easy walk Clara had come to know as well as her own heartbeat. "They had apple pie at the hotel," he said, setting the sack down. "Still warm from the oven? Did you get 2 pieces? 3. His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Figured Mr. Abernathy might stop by. He was complaining again yesterday about Mrs. Abernathy's cooking. Said her biscuits could shoe a horse." The laugh surprised her. It came up from somewhere deep, somewhere she'd forgotten existed, a real laugh, Not polite, not quiet, not measured or controlled. The sound startled both of them. Thomas's eyes widened. Then his face creased into a smile, and Clara felt something warm spread through her chest. "Ain't heard you laugh like that before," he said. "Ain't had reason to." She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her heartbeat quick and light beneath her palm. "Not for a long time." Movement outside the window caught her eye. Mrs. Harmon, walking past with her basket over her arm. She slowed as she passed Clara's shop, looked through the glass at Clara and Thomas standing close together at the counter, the paper sack between them, the wildflowers bright in their mason jar. Their eyes met through the window. Clara raised her hand. A small wave, not hostile, not apologetic, not asking for permission or forgiveness or understanding. Just a wave, just acknowledgement. Mrs. Harmon's lips pressed together. She walked on without returning the gesture. Her opinion didn't matter anymore. "That woman's going to talk," Thomas said. "Let her." Clara reached across the counter. Her hand found his warm and rough and steady. "She's been talking for 6 years. Words can't hurt me anymore." They ate the apple pie standing at the counter, sharing a fork because Thomas had forgotten to bring 2. The filling was sweet and warm, the crust flaky and golden. Clara couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten pie standing up in the middle of the day. For no reason, except that she wanted to. At 3:30, Thomas put his hat on. "Got to get back to Dawson's place," he said. "Fence needs mending before the weather turns cold." "You coming by tomorrow?" "I reckon I will." He paused at the door, one hand on the frame. "If you want." "I want." He smiled, tipped his hat, walked out into the autumn afternoon. Clara stood at the window and watched him mount Copper, watched him settle into the saddle with that easy grace she'd come to love watching. Watched him turn the mare toward the edge of town, riding out past the feed store, past the church, past the last houses before the open prairie stretched golden to the horizon. He raised one hand without looking back. Clara raised hers in return. Then she turned back to her shop. The afternoon light fell warm through the clean windows. The wildflowers glowed purple and white in their mason jar. The smell of apple pie lingered in the air. On the shelf behind the counter, a new bolt of fabric caught her eye. Rose-colored silk. Shipped in from Kansas City with last week's order. She'd never stocked silk that color before. Had told herself it was impractical. Too expensive. Not the kind of thing anyone in Stillwater would buy. Clara crossed to the shelf, lifted the bolt down. The fabric was cool and smooth against her fingers, shimmering when the light caught it just right. She carried it to the cutting table, measured out 2 yards, cut it clean and sure. And when she held the silk up to the afternoon light, she saw her own reflection in the window glass. A woman of 47 with gray threading through her brown hair and lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting at fine stitches. A woman who had buried a husband and survived the burying. A woman who had learned, finally, that grief was not the same as loyalty, and that choosing to live again was not the same as forgetting. Clara folded the silk carefully, set it aside on the counter, for herself. There is something quiet that stays with us after a story like this one. Something tender, perhaps, or something familiar, that we cannot quite name a weight we recognize without needing to explain it. Many of us have stood where Clara stood, at a window, at a door, at the edge of a choice we were afraid to make. Some of us have held on to things longer than we needed to, not because we wanted to, but because letting go felt like losing all over again. Some of us have pushed people away when what we really wanted was for them to stay. And perhaps some of us are still waiting, still holding, still wondering if it is too late to reach for something we thought we had lost the right to want. It is all right if this story did not answer everything. It is okay if something still feels unfinished in your chest. Not all things need to be resolved. Some things are allowed to simply rest tender and heavy and true without ever becoming a lesson we can put into words. Clara found her way back to herself. That is enough for today. Thank you for sitting with this story. Thank you for staying until the end.